I'm a reporter at Axios. I cover tech policy. My name is Margaret McGill, and I'm here with a great panel of experts to talk about tech policy in cities and states. To my left is Brooks Rainwater. He's a senior executive and director of the National League of Cities, the Center for City Solutions. Then we have Julie Samuels, the executive director of Tech NYC. We have Ernesto Falcon, who is the senior legislative counsel of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF. And Rick Cimerman, who is Vice President of External and State Affairs at NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. And in that role, he helps state cable associations and cable companies on state regulations. So we're going to talk about a lot of topics today. But first, I wanted to kind of give us all an overview of what's going on in cities and states on tech policy. And to start it off, we're going to talk about what areas will likely see the most action when it comes to tech policy regulations in states and cities. So let's start with Brooks, and we'll just go right down the line.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. I would say some of the areas we're going to see the most tech policy happening on the city side is certainly with scooters and micromobility. There's been a lot of consolidation in this sector as we move from pilot stages to full-scale implementation. The RFP processes are changing. We're seeing some of the companies also lay off people and pull out of certain markets as a result of the fact that there's a real focus on profits rather than just growth. And so that's changing the dynamics. Certainly, we'll continue to see things like ride-hailing shift and change as we move towards autonomous vehicles, hopefully sometime coming down the line. The other area I would always want to mention is city-state relationships. There's been a lot of preemption against cities over the years. And we've seen cities trying to fight back and kind of prove the point that innovation is happening within their urban space. And so I would imagine kind of those pitch battles to continue. Obviously, I have a bias towards thinking that cities should win. And so we'll see that happen. The other area I would mention is short-term rentals. There's been a number of regulatory kind of conversations, situations kind of changing within the city space. Certainly, the state interrelationships have happened there as well in a number of states. Ultimately, I think what we're really seeing, though, is a lot of innovation happening from cities and bubbling up to the state level. I'm hopeful that in the coming years, we'll see more and more participation where people are working better together.
I would say that there literally isn't a tech policy issue that some city or state isn't looking at. Even if you think something is so clearly, the purview of federal government, like antitrust, even some cities and states are figuring out, sometimes it's through the Attorney General, the local Attorney's General office, how they can get a piece of it. I think obviously this is something that is coming from a Congress who has not accomplished much in the tech policy arena. And I think a lot of state legislators and local legislators as well see opportunity here. Obviously, privacy and worker classification, gig economy are, I think, the two issues grabbing the biggest headlines, probably because California went first on both. So we're watching that closely, but also, Brooks, everything you just said, we're seeing, and I focus on New York City and state, and literally every one of these issues is somehow in play. So the days of tech policy being like a sleepy area in city and state government is done. And the other thing that probably won't come up much today, but I'm spending a lot of time on that I'm really passionate about is workforce development, computer science education. That's something that should be in the city and state arena, and it's incredibly important as we look at departments of education, how we're doing a lot of training in that space.
Hey, everyone. I would echo a lot of what was said. I would add kind of the questions of facial recognition, particularly police usage of facial recognition has really, we've seen a lot of initial progress at the local level because people are very, at the local level, right? It's your police, it's your local cop. And there is a direct physical connection to this and the questions of what are the powers and technologies they can deploy in your backyard. Makes it very much a local issue, which is why you're seeing cities take up community moratoriums or bans. I also think that's the reason why privacy is coming up more and more at the state level, because again, it's very personal. It affects how people feel about their interaction with the devices and the internet, and they expect activity, and any enterprising state legislator will try to respond to that need to the best they can. But not to delay anymore. But I think that there is, as Julie said, there is probably no shortage of issues because our interactivity with technology is growing. That is not seeing a response at the state or local level.
So thanks, Margaret. Thanks to the fellow panelists and to the hosts for having us here. I think so your specific question was, what are states and cities focusing on? And I think we can parse what are they focusing on? What should they be focusing on? What is the appropriate role for state and cities with respect to tech policy? And I'll defer that until you ask that question. But
I will ask it.
Yes, great. But in terms of what they are focusing on right now, certainly privacy is one of the big ones that we're following. Also, net neutrality, not to the extent of 2 years ago or last year. Rural broadband generally, but especially rural broadband in many, many states. And when it comes to cities, what I'm focusing on are broadband related activities. So, micro mobility and scooters and short-term rentals are not really my focus, although I hear a lot of talk about it. But anything dealing with rights of way generally is a tech policy area that I am focused on, and that can range from small cell related legislation and the appropriate placement of facilities to franchise-related questions with respect to broadband providers, cable video providers, and others, pole attachments, particularly municipally owned pole attachments, municipal broadband systems, all of those things in tech policy are things we're focusing on. And of course, there's a lot of activity in all of those areas.
Great. Well, thank you. I think that gives us a good overview for our conversation, and we're going to dig into a lot of those topics. But before we do, I think one other overarching question is, tech companies have a global reach. So why are cities and states stepping in to regulate them, and what kind of standing do they have? And then just to add another question onto that, can they have an impact on policy outside of their borders? And Julie, do you want to jump in? Because you look ready.
I have a lot of thoughts on this one. I mean, I think it's hard to give a broad answer to that, because even some of the policy issues we've talked about, micromobility, pole attachments, like clearly that has to be dealt with locally. It makes, no sense to handle some of these hyperlocal issues, anything outside of the hyperlocal context. A lot of the other issues we're going to talk about, and I think some of the most contentious issues around things like privacy, for example, there's real debate over where's the best place to handle it. That's a huge part of the conversation. We have seen certain states leading and changing the conversation. The framework I think about a lot of this through is that we want, from my perspective, I think a lot about how we incentivize competition, how we incentivize the next generation of companies, how we make sure that we're not just entrenching the largest players. And I do worry about doing too much of this policymaking at the state and at the city level, in that it creates real barriers to entry. So that is kind of a framework that I think a lot about. By no means do I think we should not be regulating at this layer, but I do think about how we can incentivize entrance into the market.
Brooks, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. I think I mostly agree with that. And frankly, I think what's happened in recent years is because we haven't seen movement at the national level on many of these policy issues, that it's really moved down to the state and local. That said, I'd take an issue like facial recognition, where we are seeing cities move on it in San Francisco and around the Boston area. Portland's looking at it. This really does feel to me like something the national government should be working on. And I know we have seen some movement and bipartisan movement at that. But ultimately, cities are leading because they can lead on an issue like that, whereas that, could be much better taken at the state and national level. When we look at something like scooter policy, short-term rentals, these are very much local issues. Even ride-hailing, which was preempted in about 48 states, should have been taken at the local level, because that's where the companies are operating, that's where people are using these services. Ultimately, it just simply makes sense to me to think about, if the business is taking place within the urban environment, why wouldn't you want to think about how it could work in one place and then work in another, and then take the best practices from both to find out the best policy forward? So I really think it is dependent on what we're talking about within the tech sphere. Some issues should be taken at the local level, others really should be at the national.
Rick, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. So let me add one additional distinction, which wasn't quite touched on, but in the previous discussion, there was a mention of sort of government use, for example, of facial recognition. And I think at whatever level of government, I think it's perfectly fine and acceptable and the right thing to do for the government to determine what its own agencies or own personnel will be doing. So, for example, if the city decides that the local police force should or should not use facial recognition, or conditions facial recognition on some kind of anti-discriminatory or only a database that has met certain requirements, whatever it is, for their own use, that's one thing. But on the other hand, let's say that Delta Airlines was at CES, had this great new technology that they were demonstrating, not rolled out yet, that would allow a traveler in an airport to be sort of recognized. And actually, I'm not sure it was facial recognition per se, but to be recognized. And when you looked at the screen that would normally have all of the flights that are coming up, it would only show you your information. And even if you're standing next to someone else, it would show them their information. So it doesn't seem that it would make sense for me to a city to involve itself there. So I just want to distinguish, government use of. Similarly, with net neutrality, and I promise I'm not going to talk too much about net neutrality because
we'll talk about net neutrality.
so tired of it after 20 plus years. But we did see some states issue executive orders that were procurement based that said the state will only do business with particular folks that adhere to certain requirements and all of that. And to the extent that it was truly the sort of market participant kind of conditioning the state and not outside the borders, that's sort of one thing. But if in fact it's requiring adherence to some kind of set of principles or whatever that actually crosses borders, then I would argue that is impermissible. Just to give one last example, not net neutrality based, but it's actually two examples: CCPA and GDPR. Both of them clearly impact outside their borders, because all of us, as of January 1st, every site you go to now has some kind of CCPA disclosure, whether it specifically mentions CCPA or not. And similarly with GDPR, that has impacted the various ways in which many, web providers, websites advise you of their privacy principles. And so certainly there are these cross-border issues that we need to be concerned about.
Ernesto, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's worth taking a kind of a big step back as to why all this is happening at the state level, and why these activities are happening at the local level. And it is because the federal response has either been in the negative, contrary to public opinion and public support, or inaction. Right? We've been talking about consumer privacy at the federal level not just for a couple of years, right? It's been more than a decade at least. Stretching back to the early days of the Obama administration and prior. And it wasn't until the logjam was broken by a state vis-a-vis a state ballot initiative, right? Not going through the legislative process, but going straight to the voter, that he actually got a law, which suddenly changed a lot of the questions and political positioning, I think, of industry here in DC. But the point is, people want these things. The drive of these laws are directly related to frustration, particularly in the privacy context. The lack of believing you have control of your information when you use the internet. It's pretty pervasive amongst society. Any polling shows 90% of people think they have no control of what happens with their information when they use the internet. And that will beget laws. And if Congress doesn't do it, then states will. And I don't think that's an inferior outcome, because some protections at the interim is better than none. And then I think this will be a continuously evolving process until maybe someday the logjam is broken in Congress. But we are still quite a ways away from that point, mostly because the conversation, I think, here in DC oscillates around whether or not we should just stop all the states from doing anything, which I'm going to suggest is probably not a thing you'll ever get passed in Congress. And the fundamental question of whether you can sue a company directly if they violate your privacy. There's some states that already grant you those rights, and the Congress has to wrestle with the fact that federal legislation has to take into account that there are means of protecting your privacy that already exists that are directly given to people. And eviscerating those through an act of Congress I suspect, is pretty untenable.
Can I weigh in for a second? I think, too, that there's this thing going on, particularly at the state and local level, that I find really interesting. And I think that a lot of it has also conflated with the debate we're having around privacy in an interesting way, which is that society is dramatically shifting. Like right now in this moment, living in cities in particular, it's changing rapidly. And a lot of it is because of technology. You have new players, you have companies that no one even heard of a decade ago who are now, it's confusing, it's complicated, it's hard for regular people to understand, let alone slow moving, not technologically advanced state and local governments, right? And I think that, what we're seeing play out is a lot of fear is not quite the right word, but there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's understandable that legislators and regulators are trying to figure out how to navigate that. But I don't actually think the conversations necessarily are always actually tied to what the people I talk to day to day about tech are about, which is to say that I think like fear and uncertainty is leading us to a place that I worry is sometimes actually divorced from how the technology works on the ground. And I hope that we're able to take some time to get that right. And I'm glad we're having this conversation today. And I think these issues are really complicated.
Well, let's jump into a little bit more into a complicated issue, and that's privacy, especially on the state front. I thought maybe, Ernesto, we can talk about, you went into this a little bit, how states got to the point, especially California, where they're acting on privacy, and what's next to come in California specifically, and then we'll go to other states.
Yeah, the debate over CCPA is still raging in California. For the most part, you had a few dozen bills that kind of took CCPA in all sorts of directions, and for the most part, they didn't go anywhere. And I think the consumer advocates and the industry really have to kind of come back together and realize no one exactly is making any progress on their own pet issue, and maybe CCPA will stay exactly as the way it is today, as it will be a year from now and several years from now, only because there's this stalemate. I don't think that's an inferior outcome. I think it is probably worthwhile to see the implementation of CCPA, particularly with the AG process. The Attorney General has to implement regulations that clarify specific provisions of the statute, and it's worthwhile to learn to see how the law is implemented and see what changes it results in terms of improving consumer privacy. There's lots of things that I think the consumer groups would love to see improved, and I think there's lots of things that industry would like to see in the reverse. That is the nature of the process. We will have these debates and they will continue, for I think a handful of years.
Julie, I want to ask, is New York going to let California set the de facto national standard, or?
It's actually, I think it's a really smart question. It is really hard for New York to not be first, especially for, our governor doesn't really like that. But with regard to privacy and with regard to worker reclassification, which is probably the other kind of most high profile issue, California's first. Like there is CCPA and there is AB5. And I think that New York and literally 48 other states would be remiss if they didn't say, okay, this is great. This is, maybe the laws are whatever, but let's see how they play out. Because I think what would be a mistake, because a lot of what Ernie's talking about, it's really hard once these things are baked in. Our legislative processes are not easy to unwind. And what would be a mistake would be to say, oh, okay, here's a model because they already did it. Let's do it too, without getting any learnings from it. So I actually, as someone who does this work in New York, feel kind of lucky that we can see how some of this stuff plays out in California. Some of it's probably going to work, and no surprise, some of it's not going to work. And this is actually, the laboratories of democracy. Like, how it sounds corny, but it's true. And like, if New York can improve on one thing, and then Illinois or Florida or Texas or wherever, all of a sudden now you're talking, now you're onto something, and then I think that does help you in Congress. Well, I'll say one last thing about that. Obviously, we have an election year on our hands, and nothing is happening in DC until we get through that. So the states, and now we're like deep in state session time in most states. We're deep in state session time in New York, for instance, and it's all moving really quickly.
Rick, can you talk a little? Oh, Ernesto, did you want to add something?
Yeah, if I could just add something. The other reason, it wasn't obvious to me when I worked in DC for a long time until I worked in the state legislative front. But a big difference you see in a lot of states is some states just have mechanisms that basically mandate votes on issues. And that's different than Congress in a real concrete way, in that if something was not going to have the support of leadership, for example, or if there's just enough kind of background opposition, an issue will just never come to a vote. It'll never come to a hearing. But there are lots of state legislatures that basically grant legislators a direct right to have a hearing and call for a vote on their issue. And so things that have strong public opinions behind it, it's harder. They make progress because it's harder for a legislator to dodge the issue. And again, that's why CCPA exists. And that's why I suspect you'll see more states pass laws on a variety of these issues because public opinion is pretty clearly on one side of many of these debates, and they, sometimes it leaves less room for the nuance, which is challenging, but it also leads to progress and learning.
Rick, can you fill us in a little bit about how industry is responding to some of these state efforts, especially on privacy?
Sure. Well, let's just go back for a moment, and I largely agree with what Julie had to say, which is let's get some learnings from CCPA. But as Ernesto touched on, I mean, CCPA is a long way from being perfected, if that's even the right word, because the Attorney General is not statutorily obligated to, give us his interpretation of what it all means until the end of June. Although I think next week, or maybe 2 weeks from now, he does have to respond to all of the comments that were submitted by the first week of December. So that should give us an indication of where they want to go. But at the same time, as you have this bill that is out there, and we don't know how it's actually going to be enforced yet. You have yet another ballot initiative that would layer on additional responsibilities and requirements. So, while all that is going on, I think our general caution to other states is, hold on a minute here and let's see what's happening. Now, having said that, there are some specific instances in, which we're working closely with legislators and consumer advocates and others in Washington State is an example. And of course, we'll work with legislators anywhere, even if our overall mantra is, let's hold on and see how things play out. Because what we don't want to have is sort of a constantly shifting set of rules with respect to privacy, largely because there are, not only huge compliance costs, and of course people say, well, so what if it costs you money? But obviously that gets passed on to consumers. So ultimately cost to consumers, but also consumer confusion. And, although Ernesto is right that there may be public pressure for something to happen, something in quotes, I think the average voter and even the above average voter from Lake Wobegon is not really all that facile with what is in CCPA, how it operates, what's going to happen, because even our companies, the industry that have to implement it, that have literally spent now hundreds of millions of dollars on back office and compliance, et cetera, there are still these big debates. What is a sale? Or you've got, okay, employees are not treated as consumers for a year, but what about after that year? So there's a lot going on there. So to the extent that any other state moves forward, we hope that at least the outcome, if they pass something, is interoperable, will be the word that I'll use. Not the same, but that it doesn't require a wholesale revision of systems, and we're treating consumers very differently in one state versus another.
Well, when it comes to privacy, what states are keeping you the busiest outside of California?
Well, Washington. Well, first of all, let's be clear. NCTA, we don't do direct state lobbying, but for our industry, I mean, we work closely with our state cable associations, with intergovernmental groups such as NCSL and others, and state public utility commissioners, all of the above. But I think right now on privacy, the big action is in Washington State. We will, there are a host of other bills in other states, Florida among them, New York and New Jersey will be a maybe. Illinois is, always a wild card on some of these things. But I think what's garnering the most attention, and rightly so, is Washington State, because what came out of the Senate last year was something that, although, we probably would have been okay with nothing moving forward. We spent a lot of time with consumer advocates, with legislators, with the sponsor there, and what came out of the Senate was, something that we could live with. Not to cast aspersions, but the House in Washington State was a whole other story, and we'll just have to see how it plays out in the House this year, because again, the Senate is moving in the right direction. I think I can characterize it. But the House has shown no inclination to move in the right direction.
Let's, on the city level of privacy, Brooks, are cities getting involved in privacy regulations, and what does that look like if so?
I mean, I think cities are somewhat. It's not an issue that I've covered extensively, but one of the things, as I'm hearing what's happening at the state level, that makes me think about is if at the national level, we're not seeing a lot of movement on this, and you have an upswell of people saying we need something to happen, it only makes sense that you would see it happen at the state level. So from that perspective, I'm glad to see California leading on this and something happening in Washington. I think the point on interoperability makes a lot of sense. And even as we're covering many of these issues at the city level, thinking about what is the floor of how these things should look rather than the ceiling is a really important, I think, policy perspective to take.
Can I just jump in with one point? And Brooks was certainly not advocating for cities to get in on privacy regulation, or at least it didn't sound that way to me. But I did want to sort of draw a distinction, at least in my mind, about kind of appropriate role for city regulation and not. And so to me, I mean, I mentioned rights of way as something that I focus on, but when a company is, using city property, the sidewalks, for example, the scooters, right? Or, zoning a traditional role for cities, that's one thing and an appropriate area for city regulation. But the idea that a city would have its own privacy regulations, which a handful of cities have looked at and maybe one or two have actually adopted, that would be different from the rest of the country or the rest of the state, seems a step too far to me. But if you can tie it back to kind of, the use of city property, and I'm not saying, for example, look, our broadband facilities are underground in the rights of way, so that's one thing. And, if we're doing permitting and fees and all of that, that's all good. But, those electrons that are flowing through there, the city should not be regulating in any way.
I mean, one thing to add real quickly on that, it makes me think about what's happened with micromobility and scooter data, that Los Angeles really leading the way, looking at shared data with a lot of pushback from companies, but at the same time trying to work with them because you can utilize that data for planning purposes and for many valuable kind of pieces within the city. Obviously, cities are looking at it and making sure that privacy is protected. But I would say that's an issue that's played out in a number of cities.
I mean, micromobility is a perfect example for something that needs to be regulated hyper-locally. Like in New York, for instance, There's a use case for scooters once you get out of the city center. I don't know anyone who thinks there should be scooters in lower Manhattan. And in fact, there was a bill that the governor didn't sign last year at the state level that would have actually given municipal control to legalize scooters and e-bikes all over the state. Didn't pass. Some version of it is probably going to pass soon. It's in the governor's budget, I believe, this year. But this idea that is core local governance. Literally every town and every city in a state is going to react differently, has different infrastructure that can handle scooters on the street or can't, or on the sidewalks or whatever. And I think, just illustrates a perfect example of where this kind of distinction lies.
I'll just add, though, there is this real tension, though, particularly like take scooters, because EFF's been involved in this question of, what is the data local governments are collecting? Because there's a lot of things you reveal by where you're going, right? And where you're picking up and where you're dropping off, places of worship, where you work, health, where you go for your healthcare. And there's, the advent of smart cities carries a lot of these really deeply concerning Fourth Amendment constitutional concerns of what is the information government should be able to collect about the people that live there. I mean, there's obviously very important uses in terms of, learning how people are moving within your for city and regional planning purposes. But there's also a real danger of overcollecting. And I don't think that balance is struck yet. And so in some respects, there are lots of efforts to kind of to curtail or regulate what the smart city looks like, particularly in the issues of privacy, much more from the government collection of information.
Oh. I just want to jump in really quick because it sort of goes to the point I made earlier about, government controlling law enforcement use of facial recognition or artificial intelligence or whatever. Similarly, on privacy, it makes perfect sense for whether it's, the city or state to regulate its own collection of data and what's going to happen, data sharing, make sure. I mean, because the irony of CCPA and, other privacy bills often is that it does not actually apply to the government collection of data. And when you really look at some of the worst and most troubling and most concerning data breaches out there, it's been data collected by the government that is, OPM, et cetera, et cetera.
I do want to, while we're talking about scooters, micromobility in some way, I did have a question for Brooks on this, which was the lessons learned by cities from ride sharing companies coming in and how those were applied to now scooter companies coming in.
Sure. I think the lessons learned were that, cities were taken by storm by ride hailing. Uber and Lyft came in. And while many mayors out there were really excited about this new innovative way for people to get around, and many cities where taxis weren't, widely available, they created a service that people really, really wanted. And you had constituents that asked for it. But that said, the way they came into cities was to just break all kinds of laws and regulations and just hope that it worked out. And it did in many places, but in other places, there was a lot of pushback. And when that pushback happened, the companies went right to the state level and had the states preempt the cities in order for them to operate. So fast forward to 2018, when the scooter companies came online, the big difference now is that the scooter companies actually own physical stock. And so they're dropping scooters into cities trying to use very similar tactics. And the end result was that quite a few cities just impounded the scooters and said, no, you can't operate here. And so what that created was a dynamic where cities have worked a lot more closely with the scooter companies, whether it's on the pilots or now wider scale RFPs, where you're starting to see thousands of scooters brought into many cities throughout the country. And the end result, I would say, has been much, much better. There's certainly still some bad actors out there and still challenging things that pop up now and then. But the fact that you're seeing the companies work together, you're seeing cities say that equity matters. We need to make sure that we're balancing where these scooters are within our community. All of these values that we kind of take to heart within our communities are actually being a part of the discussion. That's what you want to ultimately see.
I think that I'd also, to build on that, it's such an important point. We've talked a lot about these ways it feels like there are all these fights, but increasingly we're seeing so many more examples of cities and local governments working with companies, whether it be in the mobility space. There's a a great example in the mobility space. There's a New York company called Via that started as a ride-sharing company, still is a ride-sharing company, but also does a ton of work partnering with cities all over the world to essentially help support what looks like public transit in places that don't have public transit, bringing in technology to make that work for people. I mean, I worry in this moment we live in, and I'm probably too optimistic about some of this stuff, but we live in this space where it's like, I worry that we're going to miss some really great opportunities where technology can allow governments to provide more services more effectively and efficiently to more citizens, which is what government should be doing. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be careful about unintended consequences. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about citizens' privacy and government overreach, but it does mean that we shouldn't also shut down efforts. And in many ways, technology is opening all kinds of doors. And I think that ride sharing is a really great example. You know, I don't think any city that's had more ride sharing drama than New York City, and it continues. But it has fundamentally changed the live experience for people outside of Manhattan, where there are huge transit deserts. Taxis didn't used to go there. And now you can get a car to drive you around there. And that is not perfect. And I would prefer the subway went there and whatever. But, you know, we don't, like, the public discourse doesn't go there like it did a few years ago. I understand why. I'm not naive, but it is an important part of this conversation.
I take your point on that. Of course, I'm a reporter. I'm drawn to the fight. So we're going to do a lightning round of policy issues because I do want to leave some time for questions. So in the audience, please be thinking of your questions. And when I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking about areas where you would normally see federal action, and instead it's happening on the state or local level. So we'll lightning round topics. First one, I think, is net neutrality. It's an area where you've always seen federal, except now it's a state issue. Ernesto, can you talk about what standing states have when it comes to net neutrality, especially given the FCC phrases it as the federal policy of deregulation?
Well, we saw how that argument played out in the DC circuit, right? I mean, they lost. Telecom has long been this division of state and federal work, right? Julie, has mentioned, and this is right. Like, there are things that are just really hardcore local backyard stuff: regulation of the polls, access to the rights of way. So there's always been kind of this joint partnership between the states and the federal government. Lots of the net neutrality questions that come up are last mile questions. They're not things that happen way out there in the global internet. There are things that are happening from the tower to the device, from the local system to your home. And so it is not as complicated as industry would like to make it out to be. And I think California understood that very clearly when they passed their law. It's obviously very focused on what happens within the state of California. The infrastructure of California is different than most other states, so I think there will be some variance in other state net neutrality laws. But that's not, I think everyone admits this is not the ideal outcome. This is the best alternative we have in the absence of federal protections. And the next area you're going to see, net neutrality is one piece of this, but the next area you're going to see the state regulating ISPs is the issues of public safety. California is dealing with bigger and bigger fires that are resulting in lots and lots of people losing service in terms of state of emergencies. We all, I don't know if everyone here knows about it, but one of the big cataclysmic issues that really kind of pushed SB 822 over the finish line was Verizon throttling the firefighters in the middle of a state emergency. The idea that the state can do nothing about that is just, no, I don't think anyone really believes that. And I don't think the industry believes that, given that the next year, the state basically passed a law that banned Verizon's conduct in the future. And you saw no opposition from the ISPs. The idea that you can throttle during a public emergency. So, ideally, at the end point, we can get, restoration from the federal level. But I think the energy right now is to protect access in any way, shape you can till that day comes.
And Rick, can you give us a state of play on this when it comes to there are a couple court cases. There's different approaches in the states to net neutrality. What do you envision coming next on all this?
Sure. But first, I mean, let me just say that other than Ernesto saying that the current situation is not the ideal outcome, I disagree with pretty much everything he said. So,
that is stipulated.
and, I'm not usually one to defend Verizon, but let's be clear that what happened was that, the fire folks purchased the wrong service. Verizon should have recognized that, told them that was the wrong thing. And, it was sort of a series of mishaps, very unfortunate, but it was not a net neutrality type case of throttling. Just with respect to what the court said, there's sort of two kinds of preemption, there's two kinds of preemption, express and conflict preemption. And the FCC went for express preemption, and the court said, well, we don't see in the statute where you have the authority to simply blanket say, no, we preempt everything. I will point out that even the Wheeler order, the open internet order, said that states would be preempted if what they tried to do on net neutrality conflicted with what the FCC was doing. So with respect to conflict preemption, what we are going to see is if and when states try to pass their own laws, that the question will be, does it conflict with what the FCC is doing? So the current status is there's two state cases where the states have agreed to hold off enforcement until all court action is done, including potentially Supreme Court action. So 30 days after the final, only then might a state begin enforcing if their own law hasn't been enjoined, overturned, whatever it is. So that's the case in California and Vermont. There are a handful of other states with state legislation, but for example, Washington State and Oregon, but that's the Ninth Circuit. California, we're already in court, so that's that. Vermont is the Northeast, where we've seen some other activity.
New York has a bill.
New York has a bill, yes. And the governor wants to go even further than the order and ban zero rating, for example, which is not necessarily our thing, but we'll see where that goes. I'm skeptical in the main that we will see a lot more net neutrality bills. There are some executive orders out there. And again, the question is it only about what the state itself is purchasing, or does it condition others? But even in the federal courts now, there has been an appeal of the prior court decision. So, it's going to play out for a long time. But actually, if you look so far in the states where there are proposed bills, I'm guessing that, in mostly red states like Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia, that, those bills won't advance too far. Not that it's, purely an ideological deal,
okay.
But.
Okay, well, I was promising the lightning round. So I know we can talk more about net neutrality because we've been talking about it for years, but we got to move on to another topic really fast, and that is home sharing and short-term rentals. And Brooks, I want you to talk a little bit about why cities are trying to get in on this, what kind of impact they're having, and what do you see coming this year on that topic? And then we're going to go to audience questions.
Sure. I think that home sharing is one of those topics that has been both a challenge and an opportunity in cities for many, many years now. The opportunity side of it is there's a lot of people out there that share rooms in their houses, rent out their houses when they go on vacation or out of town for a little bit and make extra money, are able to therefore afford to live in very expensive marketplaces. So that's kind of the positive side. The negative side is there's people out there that have bought up reams of apartments and are just buying homes within cities, no longer renting on a monthly basis their basement apartments and other things, and taking houses off the marketplace, creating more challenges to affordable housing in cities nationwide and around the globe. And so when you start to kind of balance both of those issues, cities have tried to regulate in ways that really look to benefit the people that are trying to share rooms in their houses, make a little extra money, but to pull back on allowing people to rent homes for longer than 30 or 60 days, and other kind of regulations, making sure that people are actually registered. And again, I think not running disaggregated hotels within cities without having the kind of regulations we have for the hotel industry. This has become a problem, like I said, not just in the US, but all over the world. I've done a little bit of research and starting to work on what's happening in European cities. They've had many issues with over-tourism in places like Amsterdam and Venice. And so they've been, I would say, regulating even more so than many of their American counterparts. But I would expect to see this continue. In some states, there's been preemption, as you would imagine. Thankfully, not as much as you have on the ride-hailing front. But this is one of those issues that will continue to be a challenge for cities for years to come.
Thank you. Oh, can we really quickly, if any members of the audience have questions, or if there's any members of the audience with questions?
Thank you. So is there a role, and what is the role for cities and states in regulating tech companies, and specifically the way they use user data to advertise to people? And I'm mostly interested in political advertising.
I can take a stab at this. So in New York, we've had efforts to do that at a state level with regard to political advertising, not as much at a city level. I would echo some of what Rick was saying before. I really worry about taking this kind of regulation down to the city level. There is not related to political advertising, but related to some other kind of data usage. There's a bill pending at New York City Council. It would literally mean that, like, if you drive into the suburbs, your rights would change and because the way people live, where towns, talking about a state is one thing, I think, but talking about at the city level where like people live and work in different cities all the time, it gets really complicated in a way that I think not only is it incredibly complicated for companies to have any, really hard for a company to comply with that hyper local level of regulation, but also I think that, if your experience on the internet is different in Westchester County than it is in the Bronx, which is like across the street from each other in New York, I think that would not be a great outcome for anyone. So looking to the states to do some stuff here, we'll see how that plays out. I think the city is not the right spot for that level.
Okay, and with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm sorry we didn't get to more audience questions, but we got to move on to our next speaker. So I would like to thank the panelists for the conversation and thank you all for your attention.